It took exactly 47 seconds for Senator Jeff Merkley to expose the fundamental constitutional ignorance that would destroy Kash Patel's FBI director nomination. The Oregon Democrat had prepared for weeks, studying Supreme Court precedents and constitutional law, but he never imagined that the nation's top law enforcement nominee would crumble under the most basic Fifth Amendment question. When Merkley asked his seemingly simple question about due process, the packed Senate hearing room fell silent. What followed wasn't just a political defeat, it was a complete intellectual collapse that revealed Patel's unfitness for the most important law enforcement position in America. By the time those 47 seconds ended, every senator in the room knew that Kash Patel's FBI dreams were over. The Hart Senate office building had witnessed countless confirmation battles, but nothing quite prepared the marble halls for what was about to unfold in room 216. The mahogany-paneled chamber buzzed with nervous energy as television crews adjusted their cameras and reporters checked their recording devices. This wasn't just another routine hearing. Everyone sensed that history was about to be made. Senator Jeff Merkley sat at his committee desk with the quiet confidence of a constitutional law professor who had spent decades studying the very foundations of American justice. The former Oregon House Speaker had been preparing for this moment since Kash Patel's nomination was announced, diving deep into Supreme Court precedents, constitutional amendments, and the fundamental principles that governed federal law enforcement. Across from him sat Kash Patel, Trump's hand-picked choice to lead the FBI. His expensive Navy suit couldn't hide the tension in his shoulders. His legal team had warned him that Merkley was different from other committee members. This wasn't going to be partisan theater, but serious constitutional scrutiny. At exactly 2:47 p.m., the hearing resumed after a brief recess. Chairman Dick Durbin called the session to order with the solemnity that marked the most important confirmation hearings. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized for his questioning of the nominee. Merkley began with the calm, measured tone of someone who understood the gravity of what he was about to reveal. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Patel, I want to start with something fundamental, something that should be second nature to anyone seeking to lead federal law enforcement." The opening seemed routine, almost conversational, but every experienced congressional observer knew that Merkley's most devastating questions often began with deceptive simplicity. "You're familiar with the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, are you not?" Merkley asked, his voice carrying the precision of someone who had taught constitutional law before entering politics. "Yes, Senator," Patel replied with confidence that would prove to be catastrophically misplaced. "Good," Merkley continued, opening a leather-bound copy of the Constitution that he kept on his desk for moments exactly like this. "And you understand that the Fifth Amendment is really the Freedom Clause of the United States, that it was added 4 years after we became a nation because Congress and the states said, hey, we have to make sure that there's not an over-aggressive government in the future that deprives us of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." It was a masterful setup. Merkley wasn't asking complex legal questions. He was establishing the most basic constitutional principles that every law enforcement officer should understand instinctively. "You're also familiar that this applies to all persons in the United States, correct?" Merkley pressed, emphasizing the word all with the careful enunciation of someone building an unbreachable legal argument. "Yes, Senator," Patel acknowledged, still unaware that he was walking into a constitutional trap that would end his career. Merkley paused for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for the television cameras to capture the gravity of the moment, but not so long as to seem theatrical. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of constitutional authority. "So there's been a lot of concern about the several hundred immigrants who were swept off the streets of America and sent to El Salvador without due process. Does that concern you, Senator?" The question landed like a precision-guided missile. In 23 words, Merkley had connected abstract constitutional principles to a concrete current controversy, forcing Patel to choose between defending the Constitution or defending the administration he hoped to serve. Patel's response revealed the defensive strategy that would define his complete collapse. "Senator, I'm not in a position to comment on whether or not they were given or not given due process or supposed to be afforded due process. All the FBI did, and all the FBI will continue to do, is arrest those that have violated the law." The evasion was immediate and telling. Instead of addressing the constitutional violation, Patel tried to hide behind jurisdictional technicalities. But Merkley had spent too many years as a prosecutor to let witnesses escape through procedural loopholes. "Okay," Merkley said, with the satisfied tone of a lawyer who had expected exactly that response. "But to arrest, you have to investigate. Have you launched an investigation of this violation of the Freedom Clause of the U.S. Constitution?" The follow-up was devastating. Merkley had just established that the FBI's job included investigation, and that constitutional violations should trigger investigations. Patel was trapped between his duty to enforce the law and his loyalty to the administration. "Senator, I don't know that I agree with your characterization," Patel replied, his voice carrying less conviction than before. It was the wrong answer at the worst possible moment. Merkley leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the edge of someone who had just heard a federal law enforcement nominee question the basic interpretation of constitutional rights. "Well, that was my first question. Whether or not you agree with the Fifth Amendment and are prepared to defend it, it is your job to investigate crimes." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Merkley had just suggested that the FBI director nominee didn't agree with the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, a charge so serious it would be disqualifying by itself. "Yes, I agree with the Fifth Amendment. I agree with the entire Constitution, and the men and women at the FBI decide," Patel said, trying to recover with a generic statement of constitutional support. But Merkley wasn't finished. He had seen the weakness and was moving in for the intellectual kill. "So are you going to launch an investigation of the reported violation of the due process of several hundred individuals?" The question was simple, direct, and impossible to evade. Either Patel would commit to investigating constitutional violations, or he would admit that he wouldn't enforce the Constitution as FBI director. "The men and women at the FBI who are trained to open investigations will make those calls," Patel replied, falling back on the bureaucratic deflection that had failed him moments earlier. Merkley's response was swift and surgical. "So you have no influence over whether an investigation is opened?" The question exposed the absurdity of Patel's position. How could someone seeking to lead the FBI claim to have no influence over FBI investigations? "I have influence over it, but you're asking me a constitutional question." "I'm not a constitutional scholar," Patel admitted, seemingly unaware that he had just disqualified himself from leading federal law enforcement. The admission hit the hearing room like a thunderclap. Television cameras zoomed in on both faces as the most catastrophic moment in confirmation hearing history unfolded in real time. Merkley's eyes widened slightly, not with surprise, but with the satisfaction of a constitutional lawyer who had just heard his opponent confess to fundamental ignorance. "It's actually not a constitutional question. It's a question of law," Merkley said with devastating precision. "Your position is that every one of those individuals is by constitutional right afforded due process." He was giving Patel one final chance to demonstrate basic constitutional knowledge. The answer should have been immediate and unequivocal. Yes, all persons are afforded due process under the Fifth Amendment. Instead, Patel delivered the response that would end his career. "I don't know the answer to that. I'm telling you, you haven't read the Constitution. It says all persons." The confusion was complete. Patel had just told a United States senator in the middle of a confirmation hearing that the senator hadn't read the Constitution, while simultaneously admitting that he himself didn't know whether all persons were entitled to due process. Merkley's response was delivered with the calm authority of someone who had spent his entire career studying constitutional law. "I've got it right here." He held up his copy of the Constitution with the gesture of a teacher correcting a failing student. "But what you're saying is that every single one of the illegals that was sent down to El Salvador is supposed to be given due process pursuant." "That's what the Constitution says. It says no person," Merkley interrupted, reading directly from the document. "I'll encourage you to read it because it's also been affirmed by the Supreme Court repeatedly in the case of Miranda versus Arizona, which held the right of all individuals regardless of citizenship status. The Supreme Court in Reno versus Flores, the litany of Supreme Court cases was devastating." Merkley wasn't just citing constitutional text, he was demonstrating command of decades of constitutional jurisprudence that Patel clearly didn't possess. "But it's the plain language of the Constitution," Merkley concluded with finality. "It concerns me that you're not familiar with the core concept of due process applying to all persons as written in black and white in the Constitution." The 47 seconds were over, but the destruction was complete. Patel had admitted constitutional ignorance, confused basic legal principles, and demonstrated unfamiliarity with landmark Supreme Court cases that every federal law enforcement officer should know instinctively. Desperately trying to recover, Patel made one final attempt to salvage his credibility. "As the first public defender who's ever served at the FBI as its director, I am more aware of due process than any predecessor in my seat." The claim was both arrogant and demonstrably false. Patel had just spent 47 seconds proving his ignorance of due process fundamentals, and now he was claiming superior knowledge to every previous FBI director. Merkley's final question was delivered with the precision of a constitutional scholar delivering a failing grade. "Will you make sure that due process in every action of the FBI is completely honored under your time as director? Will I ensure that due process is followed?" "Yes," Patel replied weakly. under the Constitution, completely by, send that message throughout the FBI that due process must be followed, is constitutionally required. Make sure that it's done under your direction, Merkley pressed, demanding an unequivocal commitment. Sure, great, thank you, Patel said, his voice barely above a whisper. The hearing room erupted in whispered conversations as the full impact of what had just occurred began to sink in. Legal experts in the gallery were already texting their newsrooms with the same assessment. Kash Patel's confirmation was dead. Within hours, the 47-second exchange had become the most watched clip in congressional hearing history. Constitutional ignorance trended for 3 days straight. Legal scholars lined up to provide analysis on cable news shows, and the verdict was unanimous. No one who demonstrated such fundamental ignorance of constitutional law could lead the FBI. I've never seen such a complete intellectual collapse, said former federal prosecutor Barbara McQuaid on MSNBC that evening. Senator Merkley exposed a level of constitutional ignorance that would be disqualifying for a local police chief, let alone the director of the FBI. The devastating exchange revealed more than just Patel's personal failings. It exposed the administration's casual disregard for constitutional expertise in the most important law enforcement positions. The idea that someone could be nominated to lead the FBI without understanding basic due process rights shocked even veteran Washington observers. Most damaging of all was Patel's admission that he wasn't a constitutional scholar. The FBI director doesn't need to be a constitutional scholar, but he does need to understand the basic rights that his agents are sworn to protect. Patel's confession of ignorance wasn't just embarrassing, it was disqualifying. 3 days after the hearing, Senate Republicans began privately expressing concerns about Patel's nomination. Even conservative legal scholars who had initially supported his nomination were forced to acknowledge that his constitutional ignorance made confirmation impossible. The Fifth Amendment isn't obscure constitutional theory, wrote conservative legal analyst Jonathan Turley. It's the foundation of American criminal justice. Any FBI director who doesn't understand due process fundamentally misunderstands the job. The final blow came when the National Association of Former FBI Agents issued an unprecedented statement withdrawing their support for Patel's nomination. The FBI's mission is to protect and defend the Constitution, the statement read. Directors who don't understand the Constitution cannot fulfill that mission. 1 week after Merkley's devastating question, Kash Patel announced his withdrawal from consideration in a bitter letter that blamed partisan attacks and constitutional nitpicking. But the damage was already done. The 47-second exchange had permanently associated his name with constitutional ignorance. The FBI itself began the difficult process of rebuilding credibility after the Patel disaster. Acting Director Sarah Chen issued a memo to all field offices emphasizing the Bureau's commitment to constitutional law enforcement. Every FBI investigation, every arrest, every search warrant must be grounded in constitutional principles. When our leadership candidates demonstrate ignorance of those principles, every agent suffers. Behind the scenes, the political earthquake from those 47 seconds continued to reshape Washington. Republican senators who had planned to vote for Patel found themselves in impossible positions. How could they support a nominee who had publicly admitted ignorance of the Fifth Amendment on live television? Senator Lindsey Graham, typically one of Trump's most loyal defenders, was forced to acknowledge the obvious during a private Republican caucus meeting. I can't go back to South Carolina and explain why I voted for an FBI director who doesn't understand due process. My constituents may not be constitutional scholars, but they understand basic fairness. Even more damaging was the reaction from law enforcement professionals across the country. Police chiefs, sheriffs, and federal agents who had initially supported Patel's nomination began publicly distancing themselves from his candidacy. The Fraternal Order of Police, which had endorsed Patel months earlier, quietly withdrew their support without issuing a formal statement. It's not about politics, explained Chicago Police Superintendent David Brown in an off-the-record conversation with reporters. Every cop on the street knows that due process protects both the public and law enforcement. If the FBI director doesn't understand that basic principle, how can he lead us? The international implications were equally devastating. Foreign intelligence services that cooperate with the FBI began expressing private concerns about sharing sensitive information with an agency led by someone who demonstrated such fundamental legal ignorance. A classified State Department cable later leaked to the Washington Post quoted a senior British intelligence official as saying, "How can we trust constitutional protections of our shared intelligence when the FBI director doesn't understand constitutional protections of basic rights?" Merkley himself remained characteristically modest about his role in exposing Patel's unfitness. During a private dinner with fellow Democratic senators, he reflected on the moment that changed everything. "I wasn't trying to destroy his nomination. I was trying to understand whether he could do the job. Sometimes the most important questions are the simplest ones, but legal scholars understood the broader significance of what Merkley had accomplished." Georgetown law professor David Cole wrote in the New York Times, "Senator Merkley's questioning revealed something profound about the current state of American government. We've become so accustomed to political theater that we've forgotten the importance of basic competence. Those 47 seconds reminded us that some jobs require actual knowledge, not just loyalty." The ripple effects extended far beyond Patel's failed nomination. Law schools across the country reported increased enrollment in constitutional law courses as prospective lawyers recognized the career importance of understanding fundamental rights. The Merkley-Patel exchange became required viewing in civics classes, with teachers using the clip to demonstrate why constitutional knowledge matters in a democratic society. 6 months later, constitutional law professors were still using the Merkley-Patel exchange as a teaching tool. "It's the perfect example of why constitutional knowledge matters in law enforcement," said Harvard Law School's Lawrence Tribe. Senator Merkley demonstrated that even the most basic constitutional questions can expose fundamental unfitness for public office. The 47 seconds that destroyed Kash Patel's career became a permanent reminder that constitutional ignorance is incompatible with federal law enforcement leadership. When nominees don't understand the very rights they're sworn to protect, even the simplest questions can reveal disqualifying ignorance. Sometimes the most effective oversight comes not from dramatic confrontations but from basic constitutional literacy tests. Merkley had proven that when unqualified nominees face fundamental questions about the Constitution, their own ignorance becomes the most powerful argument against their confirmation. The question that ended Kash Patel's FBI dreams wasn't complex legal theory, it was the most basic principle of American justice. When someone seeking to lead federal law enforcement doesn't understand that all persons are entitled to due process, they've disqualified themselves before the hearing even begins.